Hello, welcome to our January webinar, a collaboration presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment Training and Support Center, RTSC. I am Jean Willoughby, the Training and Outreach Specialist at RTSC. Today's webinar is Understanding and Supporting Anxiety in Our Children and Even Ourselves, presented by Sheilah Gauch. Sheilah Gauch is a principal of Dearborn Academy, a therapeutic day school that services students with social, emotional, and learning needs. She is also a licensed clinical social worker and educator with over 20 years experience working with students with complicated mental health issues. Sheilah has two of her own children who have IEPs and who, because of their own school-based challenges, required out of district school placement. She is currently the chair of the SEPAC in her community. During the webinar, please type your questions in the toolbox and we will try to answer them during the presentation. Past webinars are archived on the RTSC website, along with many resources on trauma and learning and educational issues that impact students in child welfare. Welcome, Sheilah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I am not going to lie that I have some anxiety on my anxiety training, but we're going to get through this all together. And I've just practiced some deep breathing as well to kind of regulate myself as I get ready for this training. So we're going to start by looking at our goals for today. So we're going to be looking at how we understand how the brain functions under anxiety and how that impacts our bodies, our behaviors, and our responses. We're going to look at how to know when it may be more than just general worries, and what are some ways to help support your child and therefore you, and how to access maybe some additional resources as well. So that's kind of the overarching framework for today. So one of the first things I wanted to do is just kind of share with everyone probably why everyone's on this webinar today, or why you're even interested in it. We've had a pretty significant increase in our mental health needs globally, and I think it's really important. I'm a big research and data. I really lean heavily on that to kind of understand what's happening in our communities. And so what we note is that we have a 32% of adolescents have an anxiety disorder, according to National Institute of Health. 12% of youths between 12 and 17 have experienced one major depressive disorder. We have an increased suicide rate among teens since 2007, which is really hard actually to see. 30% in boys, 100% increase in girls. And then I just put on here autism spectrum diagnosis, which we know anxiety goes comorbid with autism. And so I think it's really important to have that conversation too, that we're now at 1 in 59 children, according to the 2018 CDC report. So this is why it's so important to talk about and really kind of get grounded in the neuroscience of what's happening in all of our brains, truthfully, like what's happening in my brain when I start to get anxious about this training. So the presentation you're going to see is actually kind of a smaller version of what we did for our staff orientation at Dearborn Academy. We feel really strongly that understanding what's happening in the brain actually helps us be able to have empathy and compassion and really lead with like best next practical steps to help support students with anxiety. And pretty much our whole student population, we can say, is struggling to be supported with their anxiety. So what I talk about a lot with students, and truthfully with my own children as well, because my children have pretty significant anxiety, is that anxiety is truly a very physiological response that comes from a very primal survival mechanism. I will tell you, every time I start talking to a student about this, I'll have students in my office and really dysregulated with really significant anxiety. And I do it with my own children, I do it with myself, with friends. You will actually find when you start talking and grounding people in the brain science around what's happening, I will see students slow down and start to look me in the eye and be able to connect and start to slow down, because it's also grounding to know it's, even though it feels out of their control, it's happening to their bodies, and there are ways that we can support them, and kind of giving them the basic science behind it really helps with that. So what we know is that it is a primal response. So if I will often give the example, most of my students don't watch National Geographic anymore, but I did when I was a kid. And you often saw, you know, an antelope being chased by a lion or tiger or cheetah. And that's how I explain to students what's happening in their brain, that their brain literally thinks they're about to be chased and eaten. And so all of us here really have very predictable stress responses. So if you think about you're driving in a car, you're driving down the highway, someone slams on their brakes. You have a predictable, you can feel the rush of adrenaline and cortisol, and you will have a predictable response. If you took a second to think like what your stress response might be, if you're a fighter, you're probably going to be maybe defensive and argumentative. You might try to negotiate your way out of the problem. If you're a flighter, you're probably going to try to run away from the problem or avoid the problem altogether. And if you're a freezer, I often talk about you almost look like a little pill bug that rolls up in a ball and kind of really wants to just roll under a piece of furniture and not address it at all, right? So I can say that for myself, I go to fight. I want to fix the problem. I want to take care of it. I will say the secondary part, because I actually think there's gradations of this. So when those, it's adrenaline and cortisol and your limbic system fires up and it basically floods with those stress hormones. I think there's a first response, which is kind of your first stress response. And then for me, when it gets really bad, like if I had to call 911 or like there's a big crisis, I'm kind of a freezer. Like those chemicals make me go, oh no, I can't move. So this is kind of the basics of how I explain it to students and anyone really. The other piece that we adopted this year at Dearborn and talked to staff a lot about is the hand model of the brain. This also is super grounding for students, I have found, and it's been very helpful for our staff to really be able to have this framework. So I'm going to explain it to you all. So if you kind of hold your hand up like this, this is the brain stem and the base of the skull, right? So this is going, and our spinal cords, this is going to our body. And this is like 300-year-old reptilian brain. This is like primitive and primal. It's been around for forever, right? And our limbic system, which is the hippocampus and the amygdala, are here, right? And your amygdala are on both sides. There are two of them. On both sides, like right, I believe, tucked behind the eyes. They're really small. And that's actually the house of the fight, flight, or freeze. That's the house of like, if you get super stressed, that is going to fire off, right? And the fingers are the cerebral cortex and the frontal lobe. So this is your thinking and rational brain. And so if your brain's online, this part could actually talk to the amygdala and say like, nope, there's no danger here, right? You could take that fight, flight, or freeze response offline. But it also has the dual purpose, and I think that's my next slide, right? There are two pathways that can lead to a stress response. So if we think the amygdala can fire off, that's the downstairs brain, and it can send you into a complete panic, right? So you might have a panic attack, or you think I am in imminent danger, my body needs to react right now and flood and start moving. So that's really thinking there's a lion in the room. You can also think yourself into that response by saying, I have a worry thought, and the worry thought just loops and loops and loops, and it triggers the amygdala to fire off, right? We also talk a lot about when students' brains or children's or any human's brains are offline, it's almost like you flip your lid, right? So your brain isn't talking to each other anymore. It's not communicating. So our ultimate goal is always to get the brain back online and the frontal lobe engaged to start communicating to the rest. So, what's my next thought? Okay, so in my presentation, I often have people turn and talk, but it's good just to kind of sit and reflect on what are some of the physical symptoms of stress and the limbic system igniting in this way. So I would have time, but I'm not seeing everyone, so we're just gonna keep going. So this is actually what happens to your body, right? When that adrenaline and cortisol hits and starts pumping out of your amygdala, you're going to have real physical manifestations as it lights up, right? So you might have racing heart rate, you might have muscle tension, crying, difficulty breathing, headaches, nausea. So the reason you have nausea, which is really interesting, is actually because as your body is fascinating. It's just amazing that it can do this, that when it gets ready to run, fight, or freeze up from that lion, it actually shuts down all the non-essential systems. So your digestive tract doesn't need to be online because you're running from a lion, so you don't need to digest your food. And so it makes a lot of sense that students feel nauseous when after they've kind of come out of a stress response. Your working memory drops, and that's really important to remember, especially as educators, because if we have students that are stuck in perpetual anxiety loops, we know that they can't access the knowledge that they have in their brain. It's actually just physiologically not possible. We've got to get their brains back online so that we can ask them to access their working memory. So I know for my own children, this is especially problematic when we go to MCAS or we try to take big tests. We just had midterms at their high school, and you know, I was getting constant anxious texts from them and trying to calm them down. Like, you've got to get back in your working brain. You've got to go take a walk and try to calm down, because you know this stuff and you're not gonna be able to access it. And you're unable to concentrate, right? So these are all really, really important things to remember as we start to kind of walk through this conversation. So when we look at, you know, the big question is often like, is it just anxiety, or is it actually an anxiety disorder? And we know that fight, flight, or freeze response is super protective, and we all need it. And some level of anxiety and worry is totally normal and to be expected. And it can even kind of help us to keep moving and keep motivated. When it starts really interfering with our life, when it's persistent and it's out of proportion, we can't relax and we can't let go of worries. And what we do is we kind of get stuck in this worry loop. So the other great and phenomenal part of us as humans is that our frontal lobe has developed over time to be able to future predict worries. We're actually the only animals that can, that's my understanding, that can actually future predict and map down that this might be a problem later on and I might get hurt. So that's a great skill, and it really is problematic when we think of, like, I often will give the example, if you need to go to the grocery store after work today, and you think, okay, I have a plan for that. Like, I've made a plan. I'm going to go to the grocery store. I'm going to leave work a little bit early, get in my car, make sure there's gas in it, get to the grocery store, and then have time to pick up my children. And you can let that thought go, and it just kind of, you know, it goes to another place, and you're like, I got a plan. I'm good with my plan. But there's then when it gets stuck in that worry loop cycle, right? Like, you've made a plan, and then you go back and check the plan, and then you go back one more time and you check the plan, and you keep checking. And now it's kind of derailed your day, because now you're trying to reorganize your day around that worry thought. So it's really just being mindful of, are you able to let go of the worry and move on? Or is it really disrupting and interfering with your life at that point? So this little GIF. The thing about it is our brains can actually misfire, and our worry cycle and our worry circuits can take over and actually trick our brain into responding. So if we think that our frontal lobe is telling our amygdala that there's actually a lion in the room and we have to run, fight, flight, or freeze, it becomes incredibly problematic, because there's actually no lion. So I will often give the example of my son, who had for a long time an acute stress response to his math homework, right? And we would sit down to do the math homework, and he would immediately get angry and immediately put up a wall of defense that he couldn't do it. And he would get really frustrated and basically do everything in his power to make sure that I stopped doing the math homework, because, you know, it actually felt so bad to him, and he felt so unsuccessful in trying to accomplish the math homework. So at one point, I finally just said to him, like, there's actually no lion in the room. It's actually just a math problem. And we have to retrain your brain, because it's actually not healthy that you continue to think that this math problem is a lion, and I also need you to learn that you'll survive this really big feeling and you can remap down a better experience. So I will tell you it's really hard to do, but it's absolutely possible to do that. And that's what we talk about in our next slide, which is that the brain and body actually remember. So for my son, he had mapped down the response that when he saw a math problem, his brain literally immediately fired off the amygdala and said, like, can't do it. And you could see it. You could see the fight, flight, or freeze response coming. And then interestingly, when I gave him, you know, I said, we're going to take a break. I think I tried to do a calm.com app, and deep breathing, not as helpful with a 14-year-old. So you might want to try, you know, try a different coping skill. But he actually was able to slow down enough, and you could actually see the result of the chemicals that had just kind of flooded him start to abate. And it took a while, right? But it's hanging in there so that you can say you can really do these hard things, and you can learn that math is not a lion in the Serengeti. It's actually just a math problem, and you can be successful at it. So we often talk about this, and I share it with students as if you look at like a big field of tall grass, and you think about how you're going to get from one end to the other. And you have to walk through it. And if we know what happens when we walk through a tall field of grass, it's actually that the grass pats down, right? And then we get to the other side, the grass will pop back up. It's only when we use the same route over and over and over that all of a sudden the grass is worn down and it literally becomes a pathway and there's nothing growing on it, right? So that's similar to what's happening in our brains when we have that anxious worry response. Our brains actually remember, like the amygdala says, like, whoa, that math problem's a lion. Like, I remember that. I got to keep firing off. And what I will often tell kids is that it's totally possible to make a new path in that tall grass, but it's not easy and it doesn't feel good because your brain literally remembers that it's supposed to go, like, I see a math problem, I go into a panic response. So it's actually possible to rewire our brains. I hope I'm not talking too fast. I know when I get nervous, I also talk too fast.
Fine.
Great. So I also really like to talk with students about how important and valuable and worthy they are of us doing this really hard work with them. And part of the reason that we have to challenge them and is because of this slide, right? It's actually not physically healthy to continue to have those chemicals coursing through your body. If they continue to fire, we know the research indicates that it leads to long-term autoimmune issues and just health dysfunction globally. It's interesting, we just at Dearborn, we had Dr. Chris Willard come and speak. And one of the things he put on his slide about the neuroscience of anxiety was that you actually don't need your immune system, so your immune system turns off, which that was like a new concept to me, but that totally made sense why people then have significant autoimmune issues, right? And that was fascinating to me on a number of levels, but it's, so that's a really big thing. And I will talk to students about that. The brain learns a way of responding. So, you know, it actually kind of develops like that grass. When you wear it down, it literally becomes a super highway. And the longer you allow that response to go on, the more challenging it is. It's totally possible, but I won't lie that it's easy to kind of relearn a different response because the brain's a muscle, so it definitely can relearn. We talk about that neurons that fire together, wire together. And I mean, I think truthfully, what I'm finding more and more, it just leads people to feel perpetually unsafe in their world. I mean, and we know that, like instinctively, especially those of us working in the education world and as, you know, clinicians, we know it makes them feel unsafe. I think what I'm really tying together as I do this work, and I've been doing it for a long time, but is that it actually creates a trauma in and of itself to continually feel perpetually unsafe in your world. For a lot of students, it may not be that they have significant ACEs or adverse childhood experiences that lead them to feel unsafe. It may actually be that their brains are misfiring and telling them they are perpetually unsafe, which is then actually incongruent with the world around them and is actually kind of traumatic, right? Because their brains are telling them they're unsafe. The world is telling them you're totally safe. And then you have to, I feel like what I'm watching is later in life, adults really have to come to terms with, like, why did I feel so unsafe, right? So it's really important to keep talking about this and telling people, you know, be able to change. They can be able to change. So how do we help support someone who has, someone we love, or we have anxiety, right? So over the next several slides, I'm going to talk about what we gave all of our staff as kind of a base level, how we support students when they're feeling anxious. I think what I would really share is I've asked for feedback. I'm a big believer. We all need feedback. And I've asked for feedback on when I've done this training before. And often the feedback I get is, you didn't give me enough specifics, which I totally hear. And I will try to kind of give some more concrete at the end ideas of supports. The Federation's a great one, just to say that. But I think what I would also say is the hard part about anxiety is it's really hard work for the entire system. So it's not a one and done. And we have to be really mindful that we all actually have to link arms together to help a child or another human who has anxiety, so that we all teach them that they can do really hard things. And it's hard. So I'm going to give you kind of the baseline, what we would want to do initially. And then we can kind of talk about some specifics. So I put this slide in because what I have found is when people ask me more specific questions around, like, what about a book, or what about a training, or can you suggest a person who could help me with this? What I want to really stay grounded in is that all of these things on this slide actually come from the amygdala misfiring, right? So it's actually really important and valuable to know what the root is, and what the mechanism is, because if it's obsessive compulsive disorder, it's going to be a different treatment than if you have panic disorder, right? Or if you have a trauma, right? Like, they're actually much different treatment modalities that you have to be really mindful of. And so it's just really important, I think, just to take a second and look at this list. I think what I'm also finding a lot lately is that, particularly with teenagers, what we're missing is intrusive thoughts. And we're missing that it's actually perseverative looping thinking that is very in line with OCD, but it's not the hand washing OCD that we think about. It's not the rituals and routines that you can see people double checking, checking. It's actually they're doing it in their head, and they know that the world outside says, that's not right. Like, they actually have enough wherewithal to know the thinking in their head is not accurate, so they're not sharing it. Because what I find is when I see students with pretty significant anxiety and they're coming in with a generalized anxiety disorder, when I really slow down and talk to them, like, I'm realizing they're actually trying to do some of them are trying to do their own thought stopping and, like, jarring the thoughts out, because the intrusive thoughts feel so bad, and they know, and I don't think it is, but they might say it feels crazy, right? They're not. It's just a thought, and we all have thoughts that get stuck, but their thoughts are really sticky and they get really stuck. So it's just important to kind of remember that all of this comes, and that's why we did this particular training for our staff at Dearborn, because the root, like, we're big into the collaborative problem solving, get into the root of the behavior. And the root of the anxiety is always this neuroscience piece. And then you have to figure out what piece is it, so that we do the right thing. If it's OCD, we're bossing back the thoughts. If it's panic, we might be doing some exposure work, right, to teach that you can survive it. If it's trauma, it's going to be a whole different, kind of piece of work that we're doing. So it's just important to note.
I do have one question. Yes. So anxiety can trigger autoimmune response question. So she's just giving some celiac, lupus.
So I can talk about that a little bit at the end as well.
Okay.
I happen to also have a specialty or an expertise in neuropsychiatric symptoms associated with inflammatory responses in the brain, which are like PANS, PANDAS. Like that's actually what both of my children ended up having. It took us about 10 years to find it. And so I've done a lot of work on kind of combining what I know about anxiety as well as what I know about the brain and what I'm learning about this autoimmune piece. And so in truth, yes, right? Like it's hard to say chicken or the egg, which comes first? Like, did you have an underlying autoimmune? We know that the blood-brain barrier, there's research coming out hand over fist right now about the blood-brain barrier and the permeability of it. And so I can talk a little bit more in the end, but it's definitely, if I see a student with an underlying autoimmune issue, I'm definitely, I'm going to say, go see your pediatrician, go get a screen, right? Because I'm not a doctor, but I do know that potentially could be something that could be treated in a different way. It's just using different tools in our toolbox. It's still anxiety, right? But oftentimes those autoimmune illnesses will come with anxiety, or that person will have anxiety that they think isn't related, and in fact, it's all tied together. So as we start talking about supports, I can say that we have tons of hope. It's really amazing to watch. Like our brains have neuroplasticity, right? And it means that they can change. It actually means you can take a different route in that tall field of grass, and we can really help them change their brains. So one of the first things I will do with students, especially when they're in my office, or I do with my own children, I do with myself, is I name it detainment. I think a lot of times, and we have to remember, we all have our own individual stress responses. So if as a parent, my stress response is to freeze, right? And I need to help my child, it's actually hard because I might want to avoid, like, it's a really painful thing to have to help your child through a difficult time, right? It's just incredibly painful. For me, I'm a fixer. So my kids will say, please stop fixing it, Mom. And I will then know I'm in my own stress response trying to help them, right? But I think naming it detainment and actually calling it out and calling it for what it is, I think people get worried that they're going to upset someone. And the reality is I see relief on people's faces when you actually just acknowledge you seem like you're in a ton of pain, and like you should not be. No human should be in this much pain, right? So we understand that there's a physiological root. I literally probably 2 or 3 times a day with different students ground them back in the neuroscience and that field of grass. And it inevitably, it's probably the one time that they look me in the eye and they actually start to slow down. So I think it is really powerful. And we call it out, and we call it anxiety. I mean, oftentimes as a clinician, you might be trained in narrative therapy or really figuring out how you externalize anxiety. Like I will often say, this isn't you, this is your anxiety. And the anxiety monster is taking over, and I have to call it out and say, I want my friend, Jane back. I want to talk to Jane because I'm talking to anxiety right now. And then we also have to recognize in that moment that we also have anxiety. If I'm helping my child who has anxiety, I am terrified that my child feels so bad, and I'm probably in my own stress response. So just normalizing that as well. So we have to do really what's totally counterintuitive, and this is the hardest part. We have to push back on anxiety. We have to retrain our brain that it's misfiring, that there's no line in the Serengeti that's a math problem. There's no line in the Serengeti, you have to do writing, and you have a writing disability, you struggle with fine motor, and it's really hard for you. So I don't know if anyone's seen Lynn Lyons. She's definitely on the SEPAC circuit. She does a lot of talks. She talks a lot about anxiety as a cult leader. And that's, again, kind of externalizing the anxiety and being able to say, like, this isn't you, it's your anxiety. And the cult leader, as Lynn Lyons explains, which I use a lot with people as well, is it's going to try to negotiate any way it can to stay in power. any way. I mean, it is like, and you'll notice like especially for the fighters in the group, right? Like they are going to find a way over it, under it, around it. And we really have to say, we almost have to be smarter than the anxiety and keep pushing back and saying like, nope, you can do hard things. Like, I really believe you are worthy of us staying in this with you, because you're in a lot of pain, and so we're going to help you retrain your brain. But I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not. And one of the biggest pieces that we put in our orientation for this year was, I really love Brene Brown. I've done a lot of her trainings and read a lot of her work. And if anyone has done work with her or seen her, she's a shame researcher, she calls herself, I believe. And she'll really talk about shame having a very similar response. So we really talked about it as shame has a similar pathway. That amygdala is misfiring again, and it's telling us that we're unworthy of love and belonging. And that's really, really important, because what I find is when we trigger shame in another human, you will never get to the work of anxiety, because now you are stuck in shame defense is more powerful and almost a stronger survival mechanism in some ways than that basic anxiety. So now you have a student or a child or an adult with chronic anxiety, and you've just layered on top shame. And now you have to kind of boss back 2 layers. So we want to really stay out of shame. I don't think the video doesn't work, right? So I'll just say what this video is about. So it's Brene and Oprah talking. We were just joking. We would love to sit with Oprah and have this conversation. But the reality is, what she really talks about is that shame is the unraveling of all things. It's a great clip. If you can, I think we might try to share the clip. And I was just going to share parts of the clip, but it really talks about that shame will permeate every aspect of someone's life, and it will unravel connection completely, and make it incredibly challenging to support someone. So kids who have significant anxiety and feel scared all the time, like as I talked about, like their internal world is actually incongruent with their external world. And so you have to, in order to really build a feeling of safety, you actually also have to have a really safe environment. And that means we have to stay so far away from shame. So that's really important. So that's where we kind of took a whole piece of our orientation. Because especially when you're working one-to-one with children all day long. And I guess what I would also say, especially when I think ESPs, right, ed surrogate parents are watching as well. Like, I think when you're trying to help a family negotiate how to help support anxiety or mental health, it's also really important to remember like the family culture and the cultural norms of that family, that like, because that's also how you stay out of kind of shaming, right? Like a lot of people struggle with this for lots of reasons, and figuring out it's so important to remember how you frame this conversation so that people can hear you. And that's actually delicate, and you have to stay out of having people feel ashamed of kind of who they are or their belief system or what they think. So it's just really important. So I think we talk a lot about that the words we use really matter. So when we say, calm down, don't be so nervous, or cheer up, you have so much going for you. If you just worked harder, you'd get it. We've already talked about this, and it's pretty invalidating, right? So it's really important that we remember how we talk to people and how we help join with them, because one of the other pieces in Brene's video that I was going to play is that she talks about the antidote for shame is empathy every single time. In fact, I just did it before I ran here, and I had a student who's really struggling in my office, and I will tell you, it's really hard to do these things because, like, here I am, I'm anxious, I'm getting ready for a webinar, I'm like running out the door, and I have someone who's really struggling in my office, and I have to slow way down, take a breath, sit down, and say, what's going on, right? And join with them. Like, I'm not going to say like, all right, come on, we've already done this. Like, we can do this. We can do hard things. Because that's not going to work. I will have invalidated them. So it's really important to remember that. And that is particularly challenging as a parent, because they are literally mini versions of us, like miniature versions of our own selves running around the world. And that makes it really challenging to separate ourselves and be able to slow down because we're terrified that they're in pain as well. So this, I don't know if anyone, I actually haven't seen this. We use this in orientation. I haven't seen Inside Out, although I hear it's great. I don't have the video for it. But really, it's just a clip of how we do empathy, how we just empathically listen to another person. And truthfully, in this clip, what you see is there's one of the characters Happy comes in and tries to cajole the elephant to feel better. You should just feel better. Come on, feel better. And then it's really Sadness, who's the little blue guy, who comes up and says, like, it looks like you're feeling really bad. And how can I help you? And that's actually what allows, I think his name's Bing Bong, to get up and start moving again, right? So it's really that all of those calm down, it doesn't look that bad, you're going to be fine, actually almost elicit the shame of like, but I don't feel fine, right? Like that person's internal world is saying, I don't feel fine, I feel really bad. In fact, I feel scared all the time. And by you saying, just calm down, you've invalidated that their experience isn't real. And then they start to feel, am I crazy? Like, what's going on? I don't know why I feel so bad. Yep. And this is just slowing down to remind them. So when we look at the attributes of empathy, we have perspective taking, staying out of judgment. So perspective taking is interesting because, you know, when we're in a stress response or an anxiety response, we actually lose the ability to perspective take. Because remember, we're a lion in the center, we're being chased by a lion. So our amygdala is fired off. Like, we are just tunnel vision. We got to get out of there, right? So we actually can't perspective take when that happens. So it's really important, if you're taking care of someone with anxiety, to stay out of judgment and to slow yourself down so that your working memory can regain and you can start to kind of have that calm presence. We recognize the emotion, we communicate what it looks like, and the mindfulness, right? Which is getting your breathing back online and really being mindful and thoughtful about how you, and really staying grounded in the moment. So we say this all the time. Some of our clinicians at Dearborn have this up on their walls at this point. That I see your pain and it's big, but I also see your courage and it's bigger. And you can do really hard things. I think I must say that 100 times a day. You can do hard things. Like, we can do it. We're with you. Because the other piece of the shame and needing to stay in empathy is that if children don't feel like you're on their side and that you're teaming with them and that you see how bad it is and you're like, I'm in it. So a lot of times people will want to avoid the pain that they're in and they'll want to make it better and just do a quick fix, right? Like, we just want to make people feel better, which is a really good human trait in all of us. The problem is, I will often say, like, we're actually called to kind of sit in their wounds with them and sit in their pain and say, like, I hear you're really scared of your pain, but I'm not scared of your pain. And I'm going to sit in it with you and we're going to work through it. Because that's the joining piece. And that actually helps them feel like they have an ally in it. So we put this in here that we're going to be really kind to ourselves too, because this is really hard work, right? It is not easy to support someone who feels perpetually unsafe in their world for whatever reason. And if it's our children, if we're parents out there, this is really hard. I will say for teachers, it's also, I mean, it's just hard because you have, especially in today's educational world, right? We have standards we have to meet and checkboxes we have to get, and we know kids have to do MCAS. And so we have to be kind, that like, we have to slow down and get to the root cause of the behavior, why a child can't sit in the seat during the day. It's not ever because the child doesn't want to sit in the seat. There is always a root cause to the behavior. And so sometimes we just have to be really kind to ourselves, whether we're teachers or counselors or parents, and just say, like, we're going to slow down, meet this child where they're at, and be really kind and generous to ourselves that, like, we are doing the best we can, and that student is doing the best they can. And they may not meet that standard today, or they may not get to that test. Or they may have to spend a lot of time in the counselor's suite that day. And for parents, this is the hardest part for parents. The hardest part for me, I will tell you, is that you actually end up having your own trauma response to your child's anxiety, right? And I will tell you, on any given day with my own kids, I will find that I hit my knees and I don't even know I'm on my knees again, truthfully, because I'm terrified. Like whether it's midterms, I mean, I will tell you, sometimes I want to do a dramatic reenactment of my text messages because, my son, like literally all caps screaming at me from 20 miles away saying, I can't do this, I can't do this. And I have a full reaction. And I don't even realize that I'm all of a sudden in fight mode. And I am like dialing for dollars. I'm calling every teacher I get, how are you helping my son? And I have to I've learned, okay, I've fallen back into that response. I have to slow down and I have to be kind to myself because I'm only human and that's my son. And I'm scared for him. And I know he can do his midterms. And so it's just really important to ground yourself in that. And getting it wrong has value too. I think one of the most important things I think we all do in our day at Dearborn, and I know I certainly do every day, is because when you mess up and make a mistake, so shame, I think I forgot to say this, but shame is actually the feeling that guilt is that you made a mistake and you can change, and shame is actually I am a mistake, right? So that's a much different message. And I think a lot of our kids fall into that I am a mistake. And so when they actually make a mistake, especially if they have OCD and they are perfectionistic, it is actually going to be catastrophic. So it's also remembering that we're all human and not one of us is perfect. And so I will often go into a room saying you made a challenging choice, whatever. I've made about, 10 mistakes already today, right? And so if they see an adult who's in a position of power saying I mess up all the time. Why wouldn't you mess up? And also being able to say I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Slowing down to hear a student's experience and perspective, and then being able to just find a way to take ownership for part of it. Oh, I can see where that really may have triggered your anxiety. That wasn't my intent, but the impact was different. And I think that's incredibly valuable. We do restorative practices at Dearborn, and we've really adopted it as a way for connection. And that is probably the biggest piece for us, is having adults have restorative chats with students who the students were able to hear the adults say, I messed up, because we all mess up. So you don't have to go it alone. Here's our Mission Impossible slide, right? I know, we really liked our gifts when we made our orientation. It was fun. So you can't do it alone. It wouldn't be fair for any one person to go it alone. And you definitely can't run away from it and be like the pill bug, because anxiety only gets worse the more you look away from it. So here are just some basics, right? Of how you might access more support if you need it. And I think I tend to kind of live more in the gray, in that I don't think there's any black and white answer to these things. I think it's, you have to do what's right for your family. But if a student's anxiety is impacting school, you might start by talking to their teacher and determine if there are supports to access at school to help support. And even if it's not impacting school, because, truthfully for my kids, it didn't impact school for a long time. It was really a home-based issue. School has amazing resources. I think part of a lot of why I do this talk and why I talk about my experiences and why I'm the chair of my SEPAC is because we need to break down stigma. I think, the biggest piece of why we aren't asking for help, or I know for a long time I felt alone on an island, and truthfully, I have all this information and I still felt alone on my island at my house because my kids were struggling so much, is that we're not reaching out and saying, I need help. probably because of shame, and a million other factors. But the stigma is huge. And I think being able to break it down as much as we can and be able to ask for help is huge. So the Federation, I know, has a call center, which is amazing. I often refer parents to the call center. Your local SEPAC is a great place. We have people calling all the time asking for resources. I always say I'm not an advocate, but I absolutely can get you to the right people, or connect you with other adults, because truthfully, it's a really lonely place to be, to have children with significant needs. Sometimes your insurance company actually can highlight what supports they might be able to access, and considering seeking a referral for a specialist. And I think that's really what's important when you want to learn what the root cause is, because I think some of these anxiety disorders are pretty sneaky, and you really want to make sure you're doing the right treatment for it. So I put on some additional resources. I know I'm in Melrose, and this is Melrose Public Schools puts out this interface site. I was a former Arlington Public Schools adjustment counselor, and Arlington has this amazing resource book that I like to share with people. You can go onto their site, and obviously the Federation. And so the last thing is the ruling out the medical, which someone brought up. We are finding that students with really complex mental health issues who are not being well served by psychiatric medications, right, or therapy, or really intensive intervention, and it's not budging. It's also just wondering, like, what else is going on, right? I will say, as I said before, both of my children are diagnosed with pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome, and I would never have believed it as a social worker. I'll be really honest with you. I feel like I'm trained through the DSM-5 to rule out medical always first thing, no matter what. I don't think I knew what that meant. I had no idea. I think a lot of us don't know what that means. And my children got better actually with antibiotics and anti-inflammatories, where we were thinking we were going to lose my son. It was so bad, and we didn't have any inkling of what it could be. I kept saying his physiology is overrunning him at this point. Like, all of the medications aren't working. Like, what do we do next? We had teams of people in the house. We had, all the interventions. And it wasn't until someone mentioned Pandas, and I went and got a strep titers pulled and realized they were really high, and started another intervention that he started to get better. So research is just coming out more and more that inflammation is being linked to the brain, right? And in cases like OCD, schizophrenia, there's article after article about all of the amazing brain research that's going on right now, and the links to autoimmune issues. So just making sure you're ruling out. I didn't put a lot on here because I think one of my other side gigs is that I'm kind of leading the legislation at the State House for the PANS-PANDAS legislation to get insurance coverage. And so we're really hoping to spread awareness globally about it.
That's actually one of the questions. Okay, so you just answered one of the questions about PANDAS. So,
which is
it was who diagnosed the PANDAS?
Yeah, so truthfully, this is the really hard part about the neuropsychiatric syndromes right now. I am thankful that I had a pediatrician who was open to hearing it. For some reason, I think it's actually, my hypothesis is because we're a little bit more siloed in terms of mental health, medical, and then the medical specialties are then siloed, right? It's figuring out how we all communicate. My pediatrician did know about it, and I didn't have to know what tests to ask for. I've since then kind of put together a document, which I'm happy to share as well, on kind of what tests you would ask for. I find sometimes pediatricians give some pushback around it. I think it's also, it's kind of a ever-evolving field right now. But truthfully, a parent helped me, right? And then the pediatrician, thankfully, came on board and did the strep tests. But I think to me, as a social worker, it was like a peek behind the curtain of like, oh, what do we need to talk about more, right? Because no child should be in as much pain. I mean, my kids lost a good part of their childhood to it. So we just have to keep talking about it and keep figuring out what's next to help support kids.
Wow. Yeah. I wish I could take you and put you in my purse and carry you around. So, you were such a wealth of information.
Yeah. So that's it. That's
a lot of chats.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there is? Okay. I can only see half of them. Oh, here we go. The sound of the okay.
Yeah.
How can we set boundaries and maintain them while not producing shame in our children?
Yeah. So it's definitely like a tightrope walk sometimes, it feels like. And I think how I often frame it is that it's always grounding yourself in empathy, because empathy is the absolute antidote for shame, right? So it's really staying, when I'm talking to a student and they might feel bad, like it feels uncomfortable to hear, like, I will often say, like, your body just looks really uncomfortable and you look like you're in a lot of pain and you really deserve to feel better than you do. And so it's staying grounded in empathy. And also being able to say, like, I hear that you want to kind of sit out of class for the entire time, or, for the entire day because you're feeling so stressed. I'm going to say, I really care about you. And my job is actually to sit in your pain with you and tell you can do really hard things. And that's going to be hard. Right. And it's, I will often find students who are in the most distress, they need those boundaries, because anxiety is actually seeking some sort of control and they don't feel like they have any. And it's actually teaching them that they have agency and ownership over their life and they have control and power, and giving them some of it back, because anxiety's pretty much robbed them of all of that. They feel totally powerless. And so it's being able to say, like, if I let you sit out of class all day, like, I'd be feeding anxiety, and I'd actually be saying it's okay that these chemicals are all through your body and they're not supposed to be there. There's no lion. So I see, and just being able to continually say, it's so hard. It's so painful. I'll often sometimes use myself. And like, I'm very boundaried when I do it, because students don't need to know about me as a person necessarily, but being able to say, like, but you have anxiety, but I have anxiety. What human doesn't have anxiety? There's not one. That's actually a primitive survival mechanism. So there, unless you have something going on with your amygdala, then it doesn't fire. And some people have that, right? Everyone has anxiety at some point. So being able to just join with people and say, like, I got it too. We're all in it together. We're just linking arms. Walk through it.
Here's another one that says, a lot of the supports that we provide in school can, I fear, make it harder once they leave that protective bubble. How can we support them when things even without the therapeutic environment an IEP may provide?
Yeah, so that's really important, actually. I will say, in truth, both of my children just went back to their public school setting, and they were in therapeutic placements, which were amazing and really just great for them. And I would say there's so much value and importance in making sure that you're pushing back on the anxiety and not accommodating it, because I will say my daughter in particular had it's hard. It's actually a big leap, so I totally agree. We are constantly talking at Dearborn about, especially with our high schoolers, like, we're getting ready to transition into the world. I would not be doing you any favors if I let you kind of airlift, I always call it, like, you're trying to parachute out of your day, because it's really stressful and you won't be able to do that at a job. I do a lot of reality testing, like, okay, let's think what happens when you're in a college seminar class and you have this level of anxiety. Like, I'm not going to be here. Like, you can't phone a friend to airlift them out. Like, you have to learn how to do it. So there's so much value in, even if a student has an IEP, not accommodating that anxiety. We can't accommodate anxiety. We can be kind, and we don't want, I will always say, we don't want to set the bar up here so that we have students struggling to get up over it, and then they face plant, and then their confidence tanks. And I'll always say, we're just going to raise the bar a little. We're going to push back on the anxiety just enough that they feel successful, and they can say, oh my gosh, I just did that. Like, and their brain starts to map down, like they start to go a different path in that field, and they say, I really can do it. Like, I can do really hard things. And I will repeatedly say, did you remember when you did that really hard thing? Remember that you survived it. The lion actually didn't eat you. So I totally agree that we should not be, we have to be pushing back. And all of the accommodations in an IEP are really, they're so important. And there's real value in starting those small steps of just raising the bar a little bit. And truthfully, if I can also say, one of the things that I think we've missed a little, and I've really done a lot of work, which would be a different training on caregiver trauma and caregiver anxiety, because you can't just work with the student. You actually, that parent, like me, is in a trauma response, and you have to turn and face that and help support the parent so that you can tell them they can also do hard things to support their child.
That is so true. Thank you so much, Sheilah Gauch. That was extremely informative. I'd like to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up survey, which we ask you to complete. We value this information so that we can provide everyone with the most effective information to support the wonderful work that you do in supporting children. The Visions of Community Conference is open for registration on February 29th at the Seaport World Trade Center. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day. This is RTSC.
Someone did mention PayPal as a reference, maybe using them. Parent Professional Advocacy.
Oh, I don't know that one. Oh, yes. Oh, that's great. Yep. Oh, are we still on? Yeah. Oh, great. Yay. Yeah, so someone had mentioned, and I haven't heard of it, Parent Professional Advocacy League. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm going to look into that because I don't know that. I do really think that's, we talk about that all the time, is really figuring out how we support parents, because this is like super hard work and really scary for parents to be addressing. So.
Okay, we're all set. Thank you very much.
Thanks.